The winter months are upon us and it's time to cover our heads and keep our heads warm. I'm Jan Howell and welcome back to my channel. In today's sewing tutorial, I'm going to show you how to make these adorable animal fleece beanies and even a frog beanie. The pattern comes in sizes infant to adult, large. You can make them with fox ears, bear ears, bunny ears, cat ears, and frog eyes. They're not only for little ones, adults look cute in these hats too. It's such a fun way to add a little whimsy to your regular fleece Earflap hat. You can use your sewing machine. I'll show you how to use your serger. Either one works great. It only takes a little bit of fabric and they're pretty quick to sew. You can make them with a snap attachment, a unique attached scarf, or ties. So without any further ado, let's hop right into the project. Let's go over the items and things that you'll need. You'll need fleece, of course. I'm going to demo making the fox hat, and so I have a piece of orange and some cozy white Sherpa fleece for the inner part of the hat. I also have a really cute plaid fleece for the scarf. Of course, you'll need the pattern downloaded and printed, and that's really easy to do. I'll put in the description below where you can access this pattern. You'll need some pins or wonder clips. You want to use either a universal needle or a knit needle so that you're not poking holes in your fabric. You'll need a pair of paper scissors to cut out the pattern, a pair of fabric scissors. I love using a rotary cutter and this rotary mat. You'll need a measuring device of some kind, either a seam gauge or a measuring tape. And some kind of turning stick comes in handy, or you can use the eraser end of a pencil. And of course, if you want to add a label or a tag, have that handy. I have a tutorial showing you how to easily make these labels if you want to. The link will be in the description below. Let's go over how to cut out your pieces. Let's talk just a moment about fleece fabric. There is a wrong and a right side to the fabric. And to tell that, I've explained this in other tutorials. I have a detailed fleece tutorial. But if you can see that this is the selvage edge, the manufacturer's edge, and it looks like this, and then this is the cut edge. If you'll take that edge, the cut edge, and pull it, see how it stretches? And it curls to the wrong side. If I were to pull the selvage edge, it doesn't stretch very much, and it's going to curl to the right side. As most of you know that follow me know that I like to use upcycled clothing. So another option from going to the store and buying fleece, you can upcycle fuzzy jacket or a fleece jacket. You want to make sure that it does have stretch to it like this piece does. This was my husband's. We were going to put it in the donate box, but I could see a cute bear hat out of this. So I'll be using this. And of course, I'm going to be saving this zipper. Look at that cool zipper tag with that leather thing, and the color of the zipper is awesome. So I have a tutorial showing you how to repurpose zippers, which really does come in handy when you want unique zipper pulls and colors. So for the fox hat, I'm going to make the piece around the face this white and then the cap part orange. I'm cutting this headband piece out so that I can add a scarf, and it looks like this. The other pieces for the tie will have a rounded edge here, or if you're adding a chin strap, it will come down here, and both are included in the pattern. I want to bring that selvage edge over and make sure that I have enough room, and this is the edge that's going to be placed on the fold. And if you want to get technical to make sure that this is folded and straight, you can measure from the selvage edge to the fold, and that is 12 1/4, and up here it is not quite a 12 1/4, so I'm going to fold that over just a little bit more. And now we're straight. Another thing to mention, fleece does have a nap to it, so I wouldn't want to cut one out like this and then flip it like this. You'll want to keep the fabric upright so that it will look the same. Otherwise, it can affect the color or the appearance of the fleece. I'm going to cut out one with this off-white fleece and one with the white Sherpa fabric. When using a rotary cutter, you'll always want to cut away from your body, and I love this rotary cutter because it has a safety in it, so it automatically will retract back in when you're not cutting with it. I have cut myself with it by leaving it open, and I know a lot of you catch me on this, so this rotary cutter comes in really handy for that purpose. So there's my outer headband. Now let's cut that piece of Sherpa. So I've already determined this is the selvage edge and this is the stretch. And since this is so fuzzy, I'm going to fold the wrong side on the outside. It's not so fluffy and easier to cut out. Now for the crown of the hat, I'll cut out 4 of this piece here. I've already determined which edge is the front. I am going to use up these pieces of scraps here. And I'll use my fabric scissors to cut out these little notches. It'll help me keep straight the top part of this because it's kind of confusing that you might flip it sideways and not know that this is the top of the crown piece. You're going to be tempted to flip it like this to save fabric, but don't do it. Now to cut out the fox ears, you'll need 2 of the outer piece in the orange and 2 of the inner piece in the Sherpa. So you can tell when your blade needs to be, see how it's kind of dragging when I cut? Fleece is really hard on your blades and your scissors. So the next project, I'm going to replace my blade. And I have a tutorial showing you how to go about that and a lot of other tips for using a rotary cutter. So here are the scraps from the headband that I'm going to use. Might as well cut off our scarf while we have our rotary cutter out. So how you do that is you use the full width of your fleece. We're going to cut it to 8 inches. It's a cute plaid and I want to maximize the colors of the plaid, so I'm going to measure from this edge. I've already cut it out so the edge is straight. Now it's really nice to cut straight edges with your ruler, but for this particular piece, just to make sure that I cut exactly on those plaid lines, I'm going to measure that 8 inches. And of course you'll want to cut off the selvage edge. If you really wanted to, you could cut fringe for the scarf if you wanted to on the ends. If you want to line the hat with another piece of fleece, you'll need to cut out 4 more crown pieces. Now this can be the same color or it can be a contrasting color. I'm going to leave this hat unlined. The first item that we're going to sew is the headband piece. Bring one piece right side facing up and the other piece right side facing down. Line up the edges and pin it in place. And for this hat, I'm going to show you using the serger, but you can use the sewing machine. And if you are using a sewing machine, you'll need to, on these pieces that go around the head especially, and that are going to be stretched, you can use your lightning bolt stitch, or you can use a small zigzag stitch with the width set at 1.5 and the length set to 1 to 1.5. And the overlock stitch or your serger will give it that stretch that you need. That's another benefit of using a serger. So from here and around and stop here. Leave these ends open for now. I'm using a 3/8 inch seam allowance and you'll want to find where that's located on your guide. And for mine, it's just, I'll be barely cutting off a little bit and that will give me that seam allowance that I'm wanting. So you don't get this uneven start. Line up your edges and then lift up your presser foot and then lift up the tip of the presser foot and slide the fabric underneath and place it just against the needles, and then bring your tip down, bring your presser foot down, and then go ahead and start sewing. And so I don't have all these tails and weird things at the corner when you're using your serger. Sew to the end. Take your hand wheel and roll it towards you so the needles come up in the highest position. Lift up your presser foot, pull back a little bit, and then flip it. I'm going to lift up my tip again to get that fleece under there. The edge of the fabric down to the end where the needles were going to be coming down. Bring your presser foot back down and continue sewing. You want to flip it over and make sure that you've caught both edges. Now on this fleece it can get a little tricky. The edges sometimes get, and you can see that I didn't catch that little portion of that corner, which will be which is really important because there would be a hole there. And see how this fleece just can get kind of tricky, especially when you're using Sherpa and another regular piece of fleece. So I'll just take it back to the serger. I'm going to just lift up my presser foot and slide that fabric underneath there a little bit before that hole that I missed and just sew off. I'm going to trim off that tail. The next thing, we're going to bring those ends that we left open together, right sides together, line up the seam allowance and pull that back so that you can see that they're lining up, and put a pin in there. I like to alternate the seam allowance so the seam will be lined up, but one will be flipped down and one will be flipped up. And in this situation it will be fine and it will create less bulk in that seam. And then you'll just sew down this edge. Take your turning stick and poke out that corner point right there on the side of the ear flap. Oh, that's going to be so cozy. So that is my headpiece. We'll set that aside and sew up our ears and our crown piece. Take two of the crown pieces and place them right sides together, and do that for the other two pieces. Pin them in place, and you'll just be sewing down one of these edges here. Leave the other edge open for now. I'm going to set those aside for a minute and sew the ears. To get that contrast on the inner ear and the back ear, and to have the inner ear show and just a nice flowing edge on the ear, I'm going to show you a trick on how to do that. I'm going to take the inner ear piece and place it on top, lining up the bottom. And well, you're probably thinking, well, how are you going to sew that? Because this is smaller than this. And how's that going to work out? Well, it does. We're going to I'm going to show you how to ease in your fabric. But we want to pin that top piece because we want that to stay. So I'll start at the bottom of the ear, lift up my presser foot, lift up my tip, slide that in there, and look how much is excess. No worries. I'm going to hold the tip of the ear and start sewing, and I'm holding this and I'm just letting this and kind of guiding it as it sews, and that will pull that bottom fabric in faster than the top piece. You just start and stop if you need to line up the edges. Remove your pin, and it evened out. I'm going to sew those couple stitches off, lift up my needles, lift up my presser foot, pull it back, and pivot it. lift up my tip, make sure that tip is underneath there. Put it back down, press your foot back down. Now again, this is smaller than this edge, but I'm going to bring them together and hold it while I sew. So let me show you what that looks like. When I turn the right side facing out and bring those bottom edges together, you have that little bit of orange around the edge showing, and that makes a really cute ear, right? Instead of having just seeing, if I were to sew it just the same size, all I would see is the white. You could even take that down even a little bit smaller if you wanted more contrast. We're just going to flatten that out and do this for both ears, and then I'm going to take it to the sewing machine and baste just the bottom edge at 1/8 of an inch. Now if I were making the cat or the bunny hat, you're going to make a little pleat in the ear. But for the fox, I think it's cute to have that wide ear at the base. But I want the edges to stay put together and in place while I'm sewing, because you're going to be sewing several layers together, and we don't want this shifting up and not catching this Sherpa. So I'll line up that bottom edge and just sew across the bottom there, really close to the edge on both ears. I'm just using a straight stitch, and I'm taking the length to a 4, which is a basting stitch. In case that does show on the other side, I won't have tight stitches to unpick. Now it's time to add the ears to the crown piece. I'm going to open up one of the crown pieces, locate the bottom. So these notches are nice because it shows us the top of the hat. If you were just to look at that, like, you would be, oh, which is the top piece? It will make a big difference. So make sure you're cutting those notches out. Now for the fox hat, we'll measure 1 inch from that top center seam and place the edges along the crown piece and pin it in place. And we're going to take it to the sewing machine and baste it in place again. That way we are making sure that that ear is not going to slip while you're sewing, come out of place, and then not catch all the edges. It saves you a lot of frustration, and it's worth the time and effort to do that basting stitch. So we use that again, that basting stitch right along the 1/8 inch seam allowance. I've basted those ears on. Now I'm going to take the other crown piece with the right side facing down, line up the seams at the top, now we'll sew from this edge to this edge. If you're using a sewing machine, you want to back stitch at the beginning and the end of your seam using that 3/8 inch seam allowance. Flip the right side facing out, and there you have some really cute fox ears. Now let's sew the crown to the headpiece. With the wrong side of the headband facing out, first we need to locate the halfway points or the quarter points to match the crown piece. So obviously the back seam is the back, and I'll pin that in place so that we make sure that those seams are together. And then I'm going to find the halfway point. Now when you cut out your headband piece, you cut out a little notch, but we want to make sure that after sewing and everything that is still legit, because you don't want the front of the headband not centered. So I'm going to find that fold, and it's kind of tricky with this Sherpa fleece, but on the inner fleece you can kind of see where that halfway point would be, and I'm going to mark that with a pin. And then to find the quarter pieces or the side centers, Take the front piece, align it with the back seam, and mark that with a pin. Do the same on the other side. Take your hat, take the crown piece, the front center, and slip it inside. Match up that front center seam with your pin and pin it in place. Go to the back, line up the back seam, and pin it in place. So before I sew, I like to take the ear flaps, line them up, and just make sure that that is centered, because sometimes for some reason this just gets off and we don't want that. Okay, so let's take it to the sewing machine or the serger and sew all the way around, back stitching at the beginning and the end of the seam. I like to start at the back center seam. When you get back to where you started, continue sewing and then make a quick angle off. So there you have it, the fox hat. Now we need to add the attached scarf. You can see on this adult hat how I've used the Sherpa on the outside, which is really cute, and a Sherpa on the top. Take your scarf piece, fold it in half, and mark the halfway point with a pin. Take your hat, right side facing out, and place the scarf right side facing down. Line up the halfway point with the back seam, pin it in place. And without stretching the fabric, just run the edges down to the point of the ear flap and pin that in place. Same on the other side. And we're not going to use a serger at this point. We're just going to use a regular sewing machine to sew from this edge of the ear flap over to the end of that ear flap. I like to have the scarf on top so I can make sure that those edges are lining up as I sew. And I'm using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. I'm going to back stitch. So there's that scarf added to the hat, and no worries about this cut edge fraying. Fleece will not fray. Now let's go over how to make the hat with a chin strap, and I'm going to show you how it's done using a regular sewing machine. This is what the chin strap pieces look like. I'm going to sew down here and around and leave these side seams open again. And I'm going to use the lightning bolt stitch, or you can use that small zigzag stitch again to sew around here, because this will be a part of the hat that gets stretched and we don't want the seams to pop. I'm going to show you how a simple small zigzag stitch works just great. I've set my machine to a zigzag stitch, 1.5 in width and 1.5 in length, and I'm using the edge of my presser foot, which will give me a 3/8 inch seam allowance. So you can see that little zigzag stitch, and when I pull it, it stretches, and on the other side it looks just as if you had used a straight stitch. And something to mention, when you're using the single needle machine and not the serger, you want to open up the seam allowance like this and line up that seam and pin it in place. If you don't open those up and just finger press them, they'll bunch up and either flip to one side, and you won't have a smooth seam right there. Let me show you how to sew these ears. So line up the bottom edges. I'm going to put my stitch back to a straight stitch because we don't need to worry about this ear being stretched. So I'll pull that edge over. And at this point I'll take the end and just hold it with my fingers while I line up those edges. So that's what it looks like, no worries. Because when we turn that inside out, it will have that inner fluffy white ear. Let's clip those corners of the chin strap. I'm going to clip here and then notch out my corners so that we'll turn more evenly. Turn it right side facing out, poke out those corners so it is a square edge. And we'll just proceed like we did with the other hat. But let me show you how to add the bunny ears. Clip around those edges to trim down the seam allowance a bit. Oh, those are pretty cute ears. Before I sew that to the crown piece, see how this bottom end wants to come up. If I don't baste that together, then when I'm sewing it to my crown piece, then most likely that's going to come down. I'm not going to catch it in the seam, and we don't want that. So I'm going to pull that up, ends even, center it. Let me show you how to sew these again. I've basted the ends, which will save you a lot of grief in the long run. Instead of placing them an inch away from the seam, I'm going to bring them right together, right side facing down, and then take it to the sewing machine and baste them in place. Trim your seam allowance to get rid of some of that bulk. I have marked my halfway points, and we'll sew this in just like we did the other hats, finding the front, line up the seams, pin it in place. And then once we get that, we're going to sew all the way around, and then we'll add the lining. Another thing to mention is to make sure that these seam allowances are open and flat. When you use that single needle machine, you have these seam allowances, and if you don't open them up, one's going to flip to the side and it'll cause a lot of bulk and it won't look as nice. Now this first time around, you don't need to use the lightning bolt stitch or the zigzag stitch because we will be reinforcing that on when we add the lining. And use a basting stitch on this first round with a length of 4. Okay, let's add the lining. I've sewn around here using a basting stitch. The ear flap wrong side is facing out. I'm going to use this fleece fabric for the lining, and you're going to sew it up just the same way, except we're going to leave about a 1.5 to 2 inch opening so that we can flip it inside out. You'll see in just a minute how that works, but we'll need to leave that opening there, and we'll sew that up when we're finished. Okay, I've sewn around, I've left that opening. I've sewn around here using a basting stitch. The ear flap wrong side is facing out. Just gather all that up and place it inside the lining piece. And that opening I'm going to have on the back seam. I'm going to open up the seam allowance, pin that in place. So it just looks like a filled bowl, everything stuffed inside the lining piece. Take it to the machine and sew where we've already sewn. I'm going to use just the zigzag stitch. So another thing to mention is if you have to unpick that lightning bolt stitch, it's a booger. The zigzag stitch is a little easier to unpick if you need to. So on fleece, I do like to use the zigzag stitch. So it's just preference. So following that pre-sewn stitching, just start sewing it around and make sure you're taking out your pins. And take your time to line up the edges because you are sewing through several layers of fabric, so just take your time. I am going to trim off that excess, and again you want to check the other side to make sure that you caught all layers. You don't want to get that seam allowance too small. Is where that magic happens. Open up that little hole that you left and grab the ear or the part of the hat and just start pulling it out. All right, give it a good shake. To take care of that hole, you can do the ladder stitch, and I demonstrate that on the other hat tutorial, and I'll also put a link in the description below if you want to sew that by hand. You can just use a needle and thread, or I'm going to just take it to the machine, tuck my seam allowance inside and kind of pull it, and that will fold the fabric in. And you can pin it, or I'm just going to take it to the machine and sew really close to the edge, like 1/8 of an inch, to close that off. Clip the threads, and let's pull that right side facing out. And there you have your bunny ear hat. Now let me show you how to apply the snaps. Now instead of snaps, you can use Velcro if you wanted to, placing the Velcro one piece here and one piece here so it goes together like this. I love using snaps. It's just easy and quick, and I'm going to show you how to add 2 snap. This makes it adjustable. So I really like these cam snaps. I have a tutorial showing you all the details about the cam snaps. This is a very affordable way to add snaps. You can buy a kit. You just take your awl. I'm going to measure 1 inch from the bottom edge and find the center and just stick my awl in there and poke a hole. We want to make a noticeable hole. You'll need 3 of the thumbtack pieces and a male and a female piece. And if you want to, like I say, get more information about these to understand it better, you can watch that tutorial. So I'm going to, from the right side in, apply that thumbtack piece through that hole and poke it out so you can see it. I'm going to take my male piece with the hat side facing up, place it on top, and just push it down. Take the pliers, slide the fabric in until the snap kind of sits inside. You can kind of hear it snap in place. Give it a good squeeze. There's your first snap. Now on the other side, we'll measure that 1 inch, poke a hole in the center, find the center, wiggle it around, and now we're going to, from the wrong side facing forward, apply that tack piece through the hole. Make sure you can see it there and feel it, and then take the female piece with the cup side facing up, pinch it together, and then from the underside again. So you'll need 2 female pieces and 1 male piece. I'm going to measure 1 inch from that first snap and poke another hole. From the back side to the front. So pretty handy, pretty cute. And you can also see how to apply that Velcro on my other fleece hat tutorial. Now we have one more method to show you, showing you how to add the ties. The only thing different on the tie hat is you'll be using the pattern piece that looks like this. You'll need to cut 2 strips of fleece, 2 inches by 20 to 21 inches. You might want to go a little shorter if you wanted to on the child size. And I'm going to use the cat ears for this tutorial. And on that inner ear piece, I'm using a cute piece of felted wool sweater. That gives it a little bit of color and it adds a little bit of character. As most of you know, I love using upcycled sweater for projects. So you'll need to sew your strips first. I'm going to place the right sides together, sew all the way down one end and along the bottom of one end, but leave the top open. You'll need to turn that right side facing out. I use your turning stick, just poke the end and start pushing it through. All right, I have my headband pieces facing right sides together. I'm going to open that up and take the ties and place it just along the bottom there. And you can take it to the sewing machine and base that in place if you want to, or you can just put them together and pin it in place, which is just fine. I like to extend the tie out about 1/4 inch past the headband piece just to make sure that I'm going to catch that completely. You'll just proceed as you would the other hats, sewing around, leaving these ends open. I'm going to sew up these other pieces and I'll show you what this cat hat looks like when I'm finished. So for the cat ears, I am adding that pleat and I am going to sew it 1 inch from that center seam. So a little bit of space between the ears at the top of the head. So there's your cat hat version. You could embroider a nose and some whiskers if you wanted to. Ties you can just leave hanging down, or tie them around your neck. For the frog beanie, you'll need to cut out 2 of the green outer eye pieces and 2 white outer pieces, and 2 of the black inner eye pieces. And I am just using felt that will be easier to sew onto the white fleece. The first thing that you'll do with these eyes, place the black inner piece centered on the white and pin it in place. And then we're going to take it to the sewing machine and sew all the way around using a satin stitch, basically just a tight zigzag stitch. I'm using black thread and I'm going to stitch so the outside of the zigzag hits the edge of the black felt piece. I'm going to turn my hand wheel towards me a few times just so I can gauge where that stitch is going to be. And take the green outer piece, place it right side facing down. I'm going to pin that in place and sew around using a straight stitch, and it doesn't have to be the stretch stitch. You'll need to clip around the seam allowance to get rid of some of the bulk and allow those curves to lay flat when we turn it right side facing out. So on this little notch right here, I'm going to make a notch on that corner. Take off some of the bulk. I'm going to make little V notches, just little tiny ones, making sure that I'm not cutting into the seam itself. Turn that right side facing out. Smooth out those corners with your finger. And there's one eye. We'll do the same thing with the other eye. To make these eyes a little more puffy when you apply them, take your fiber fill stuffing and shove some in there and smooth it out. They don't need to be real big, maybe that thick. And then I'm going to take it to the sewing machine and just do a basting stitch around that circle there to keep it in place and flat when we sew that into the beanie cap. I'm using a long stitch, the stitch at length 4, just to baste that bottom edge together so it doesn't shift when we're putting it onto the hat. So I have my crown pieces sewn together already. I know that this is the top edge, really important. I'm going to take the eyepiece, place it right side facing down, take the edge of the eye, so about your 2 inches again, but I'm going to line up the end of that round circle part with the edge of the fabric. So we're having this piece stick out just so that we can make sure that we get that rounded edge caught in the seam. And then we'll take it to the sewing machine and baste again. They're basted in place, and you want to open those up and make sure that they're even and to your liking before we put the other crown piece on top and sew it all together. Right sides facing together, center seam lined up. Now you are sewing through a lot of bulky stuff, so just take your time. If you feel more comfortable using your single needle machine, go ahead and do that. And before you go any further, you'll want to turn it over and make sure that you've caught all the fabric layers. Now we're going to add that to the headband piece just like we did with the other hats. On any of the hats, if you have a front piece of the ear that needs to be facing forward. This is really important so you don't get eyeballs that are facing backwards, which I have done before. So this is obviously the front of the hat, and we'll leave that facing the right side facing out. And the cap, it doesn't really matter if you have the same color on the front and the back, but if you have, we want the right side of the headband piece to be facing inside. So I hope that makes sense. So when I put this together, this is the right side of the headband piece, even though they both are the same color. Just so that if you do use a different color, that you are putting the pieces together correctly, or you're going to have the eyeballs facing the wrong direction. Front to front, center, and I've already marked my halfway points. And then we'll just proceed and sew around just like we did the other hats. So there you have Mr. Frog Hat, pretty cute. I am going to add my cam snaps to the chin strap. If you enjoyed that tutorial, like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Click on the bell so you can be notified when I put new videos up. If you haven't checked out my tips for sewing with fleece, you might want to check that out. It's loaded with some good tips that you may have not seen before when you sew with fleece. And perhaps you have some scraps from some other projects that you can make a few hats up with. And if you want to add that tag or label, check out my other videos on how to do that, and also check out how to make your own labels. I get a lot of questions about where I get my labels, and I make my own. It's really easy to do. I'll put the link in the description below for that as well. If you have any questions about where to find things, always check the description. I put a lot of information down there for links to my website, my links to patterns, and other things that you might find helpful. These would make great gifts for your kiddos and for your adult friends. They're so cozy, warm, and a little whimsy. Have a wonderful day, have fun sewing, and we'll see you next time.